Welcome back to Kuma English Listening Hub. In today's episode, we are heading into the nighttime streets of Britain's cities to explore a creature that divides opinion, inspires headlines, and raids the occasional bin, the urban fox. If you have ever walked home late in London, Manchester, or Birmingham, you may have seen one slip across the pavement, tail held high, pausing under a street lamp to give you a rather unimpressed look. For some people, that moment feels almost magical. A reminder that nature has not entirely given up on our concrete landscapes. For others, it is slightly unsettling. After all, foxes are meant to belong in the countryside, are they not? In this two-level listening episode, we will examine the hidden life of urban foxes and what it reveals about British cities, British culture, and our often contradictory relationship with nature. We will look at how foxes ended up in our streets, why opinions about them are so polarized, and what this tells us about class, media narratives, and environmental ethics in the UK. As always, you will hear sophisticated British English, including idiomatic expressions, nuanced arguments, and a tone not unlike a BBC Radio 4 documentary. So, put the kettle on, settle in, and let's begin. Let's start with a simple observation. In many British cities, foxes are now as common as pigeons. They wander down terrace streets, squeeze through garden fences, and help themselves to late-night leftovers from overflowing bins. For some Londoners, hearing a fox scream at 3 in the morning is as familiar as hearing the last train rumble past. This situation is relatively recent. Until the mid-20th century, foxes were largely associated with rural Britain. Hedgerows, fields, and of course, the very controversial tradition of fox hunting. So how did we get from foxes in fields to foxes on the high street? There is no single cause, but several factors came together. First, British cities expanded dramatically after the Second World War. Suburban housing estates, with their gardens, sheds, compost heaps, and generous rubbish collections, created ideal habitats for opportunistic animals. To a fox, a neatly kept suburban street is not a human space at all. It is an all-you-can-eat buffet, properly laid out and regularly restocked. Second, changes in waste management created a steady food supply. Black bin bags left on the pavement overnight are, from a fox's point of view, absolutely brilliant. Why chase a rabbit across a muddy field when you can rip open a plastic bag and find chicken bones, half a sausage roll, and the remains of a supermarket roast? Third, foxes themselves are astonishingly adaptable. They are intelligent, curious, and not remotely bothered by our idea of where they ought to live. Given half a chance, they will simply move in, as if to say, fair enough, you have built this city, but we are happy to share. However, the arrival of foxes in British cities has not gone unnoticed. It has produced a very human reaction. Moral panic in some quarters and romantic enthusiasm in others. Tabloid newspapers in particular have a long history of sensational stories about so-called urban fox attacks. A dramatic headline about a fox biting someone's hand will appear, often accompanied by a slightly blurry photo and words such as terror and menace. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are utterly keen on foxes, leaving out food for them every evening, posting videos of them on social media, and treating them almost as honorary pets. The truth, predictably, lies somewhere in between. Let us look first at the fear. Are urban foxes genuinely dangerous? Most wildlife experts would say not particularly. Foxes are wild animals, and like any wild animal, they can bite if cornered or threatened. But in terms of real risk, they are far less dangerous than cars, dogs, or even badly maintained staircases. Statistically speaking, if you trip over a loose paving stone while staring at a fox, the paving stone is probably the real threat. So why do stories about foxes cause such an emotional response? Part of the answer lies in cultural symbolism. In British folklore and children's literature, the fox is traditionally a trickster. Clever, sneaky, slightly untrustworthy. From Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox to tales of foxes stealing chickens from farms, the animal is often cast as the villain. It is not just an animal, it is a metaphor for cunning behavior. When that figure steps out of the countryside and into the city, into our gardens and onto our doorsteps, it can feel like a boundary has been crossed. It is no longer the distant trickster in a storybook. It is the creature on your patio, staring at you through the French doors while you wash the dishes. On the other hand, there is genuine delight. Many city dwellers, especially those without easy access to green spaces, feel rather charmed when they see a fox trot down the street, tail like a small banner behind it. For them, the fox represents a form of resistance, nature refusing to be entirely pushed out by tarmac and concrete. This reaction connects to a broader cultural shift in Britain. Over the last few decades, there has been growing interest in rewilding, biodiversity, and urban nature. Programs on the BBC, from Springwatch to various radio documentaries, have encouraged people to see their local parks and gardens as ecosystems, rather than simply as bits of decoration. In this context, the urban fox becomes a symbol of ecological resilience. It is not a pest, but a slightly scruffy neighbor who has, despite everything, managed to get things sorted. However, it is not all harmony and poetic observation. There are genuine sources of conflict. Gardeners complain about foxes digging up flower beds, leaving droppings, and rearranging carefully planted bulbs. People with small pets worry that a fox might attack their rabbits or cats, though the evidence for this is patchy and hotly debated. Then there is the question of feeding. Some residents leave out dog food, leftovers, or even specially bought meat, keen to support their local fox family. Others, including many councils, actively discourage this practice, arguing that it leads to overpopulation, disease, and unpleasant mess on the streets. At its heart, this is a debate about responsibility. Once we start feeding wild animals, are we still living alongside nature, or are we simply creating a different kind of dependency? There is also a subtle class dimension, which is very British in flavor. In some leafy, middle-class neighborhoods, foxes are discussed over brunch, with people sharing adorable photos and saying things like, "It is quite sweet, really, he just curls up at the end of the garden." In poorer areas, where rubbish collection may be less reliable and people have fewer options for secure storage, foxes can feel far more like a nuisance, ripping open bin bags and leaving the street in a state. The same animal is experienced differently depending on where you live and how much power you have to control your environment. So when someone says foxes are lovely and someone else replies, "No mate, they are an absolute nightmare," both can be describing something real. Their disagreement is not only about animals, it is also about inequality, infrastructure, and whose concerns get taken seriously. At this point, you might be thinking, all right, but what are we supposed to do about them? Some people argue for culling, that is, controlled killing to reduce the population. Others insist that culling is both cruel and largely ineffective because foxes reproduce quickly and new animals simply move in to replace those removed. Wildlife organizations in the UK generally argue for coexistence. Secure your bins properly. Do not leave out food. Block gaps under sheds where foxes might den, and learn to live with the occasional visit. It is a very British compromise. A sort of unspoken agreement between humans and foxes. You stay over there, I will stay over here, and we will both try not to make too much of a fuss. From a linguistic point of view, the way British people talk about foxes is quite revealing. In some newspaper articles, foxes are described in almost criminal terms. Gangs of foxes, bold raids on gardens, a family terrorized by fox attacks. The language of crime is transferred onto animals that are simply trying to survive. In other contexts, particularly in softer human interest pieces or nature writing, foxes are portrayed almost as characters. Mr. Fox from down the road, a regular visitor who pops by for a biscuit. We shift from criminalizing them to semi-domesticating them in our imagination. This ability to hold contradictory narratives at the same time is very characteristic of British public discourse. We can be outraged on Monday, sentimental on Tuesday, and slightly bored by the whole thing by Friday, when some news scandal appears on the front page. For advanced learners of English, urban foxes offer a surprisingly rich topic. You can talk about them in terms of ecology, urban planning, media sensationalism, class, ethics, or everyday life. The discussion can move smoothly from light anecdote to serious social analysis, which is precisely the sort of flexibility that C2 speakers are expected to manage. So let us highlight some language from this episode that you might find useful. Listen, and if you like, repeat these items. Urban wildlife. Animals that live not just in nature reserves, but in streets, parks, and gardens. Moral panic. A strong feeling in society that something is dangerously wrong, often exaggerated by the media. Rewilding. Efforts to restore natural habitats and allow ecosystems to function more freely again. Tabloid. A type of popular newspaper known for short articles, large headlines, and often sensational stories. To cull. To kill some animals in a controlled way, supposedly to manage a population. Coexistence. The state of living together, often with some tension but without major conflict. Sensationalism, presenting information in a way that is shocking or exciting, sometimes at the expense of accuracy. Resilience, the ability to survive, adapt, and recover from difficulties. Now, a few very British expressions and idioms that appeared or were implied in our discussion. Spot on, exactly right. Brilliant, excellent, very good. Proper, genuine, real, or in good order depending on context. Keen on, enthusiastic about, or fond of something. Fair enough. A way of saying that something is reasonable or acceptable. Sorted, organized, under control, or resolved. Knackered, extremely tired. Blimey, an expression of surprise. Mate, an informal word for friend or simply the person you are speaking to. Try using some of these in your own sentences about nature and city life. For example, you could say, "My local park is brilliant in spring." Or, "After a 10-kilometer walk, I was absolutely knackered, but seeing a fox at dusk was spot on." Let us now think about how you can use this episode to push your English towards a truly C2 level. Here's one study plan you might try. First, listen once without the script. Do not worry if you cannot catch every single word. Focus instead on the overall argument. How does the speaker move from history to culture to ethics and finally to language? Second, listen again while following the transcript. Pay attention to how informal expressions, such as "all right, mate," or "fair enough," sit alongside more formal vocabulary like coexistence, resilience, and sensationalism. This mixture is typical of educated British speech, especially in radio documentaries and discussions. Third, practice shadowing a short section, perhaps a paragraph that contains an idiom or two. Try to imitate the rhythm, intonation, and linking between words. At C2 level, it is not just about saying the right thing, but saying it in a way that sounds natural. Fourth, record yourself giving a 2 or 3-minute mini talk in response to this question. Should we treat urban foxes as pests to be controlled or as neighbors to be respected? Try to include at least 3 of the expressions from this episode and aim for a balanced, nuanced argument. Fifth, if you have time, write a short opinion piece, perhaps 2 or 3 paragraphs, comparing urban wildlife in your own country with the situation in British cities. Do you have animals that divide opinion in a similar way? What does that reveal about your society? Before we wrap up, here are a few reflection questions. You can think about them, discuss them with a partner, or write your answers. 1. Have you ever seen wild animals in a big city? How did you feel about them being there? 2. Do you think the media in your country exaggerates certain animal-related stories? Why might they do that? 3. In your view, who should decide how to manage urban wildlife? Scientists, local councils, individual residents, or someone else? 4. Is feeding wild animals ever a good idea, or does it always create problems? 5. What does your attitude towards animals say about your values and your idea of what a city should be? You have reached the end of this episode of Kuma English Listening Hub. Today we explored the hidden life of urban foxes in Britain and what our reactions to them reveal about culture, class, media, and our uneasy relationship with nature in the city. We have seen that a single fox on a pavement can raise questions about responsibility, fear, delight, and coexistence. We have also used that fox as a doorway into advanced British English. Idioms, expressions, and patterns of thought that will help you sound more like an educated, confident speaker. If your brain feels a bit knackered after all that, fair enough. It means you have been working hard at a genuinely high level. Thank you for listening today. If you found this episode helpful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a mate who is also aiming for C2 English. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and if you spot a fox on your street tonight, you might see it a little differently. Cheers from Kuma English Listening Hub.